that amazing? So he told me the name of that. I was going, yep, he got it free. So thank God for that.
You know, we started out the year, and the Lord gave Dawn a word about being a good year. And so the tire thing is really fun. When she says people got new tires, you know, it's fun. And then you get new cars. And we had that, you know, where if you were here a week ago or 2 weeks ago, whatever it was, and all of a sudden a bunch of people just that week in our congregation got new cars. My sister just texted me. She said she got a new car. You know, it's this kind of beginning of the year excitement. Lord gives us a word about a good year. And does the blimp, which is tires and all that stuff. And it's just fun to work with that, to run with that. What it does is it builds faith. It just builds faith. You know, it's just, and someone could say, well, what does that have to do with anything? You can be a curmudgeon, I don't care. Or you can walk in excitement and life and faith. You know, this is fun stuff. So anyway, okay. If you will open up your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 25. I was talking to someone recently, and the person looked at me somewhat mournfully and said, we're cruising right through the end of book of Acts. And they really enjoyed it. And so they were like, oh, now what? I said, well, there's the rest of the Bible we can do. But anyway, today we are in the book of Acts, chapter 25. We'll be starting with verse 1. And I have creatively entitled today's message, Jesus' Plan Continues to Unfold, part 4. Because this is we're still working with what happened when Paul was seized by the people at the temple as he was just worshiping and fulfilling his vows. And he was falsely accused of starting a riot. The riot started around him because some people that didn't like him from Asia Minor falsely said some things about him, made some assumptions that were untrue, said he had brought Gentiles into the temple. You wanted to stir up a crowd, just say, hey, there's some Gentiles in the temple. They'd say, and they would get really upset. So he was getting beaten to death. The Roman tribune comes running in to be able to save his life. And the tribune takes Paul into the fortress. Obviously, there's more to it than that. He had a chance to address the crowds. But in the process of everything, he takes him back to the Sanhedrin, and a riot starts there around him. And then Jesus shows up to Paul and says, you're going to Jerusalem. Don't worry about these clowns. He didn't use the word clowns. That was my word, okay, just in case you're wondering. And so he ends up, okay, I'm going to Jerusalem. To Rome, okay? You're going to Rome. Go. Don't worry about what they say. You're getting there. Remember, that had been his heart. He had written the Romans. I want to stop by. So as he is, then we hear about a plot against his life, and they want to bring him back to the Sanhedrin, and they spirit him away to Caesarea, and then he runs into the procurator by the name of Felix, and Felix was a nasty man. He did some awful stuff in Judea. He overreacted to everything. He wasn't singularly responsible for the Jewish wars, which started in 66 A.D. And by the way, he was relieved of his duty at the end of 59, beginning of 60, so 6 years before the war sparked off. But he was a big part of the simmering tensions and everything that was going on because he had reacted so harshly. Because of the fact that he wanted a bribe from Paul, because of the fact that he wanted to give some sort of favor to the Jewish people so they'd say nice things about him in Rome, he left Paul in prison even though there was no reason. If he'd been a righteous judge, he would have released Paul. The charges were inappropriate. But he kept him for 2 years, just at his pleasure, because he didn't want to make a decision, because a decision would have been politically inconvenient. And so Paul was denied justice. As I said last week, though, that gave Luke the opportunity to finish 2 books that he was working on by the name of the book of Luke and the book of Acts. And so now we're at the end of that time. Felix gets recalled to Rome because he had been absolutely brutal even in Caesarea. and he had killed a bunch of Jewish people, overreacting to another situation that was going on, had plundered their worldly wealth, which is never a good idea when you want to say in Rome, no, I'm just doing my job. You made their descendants poverty-stricken. You took all their money. And so he was recalled. The only reason he lived through the recall is because his brother still had Nero's ear at this time. Now, when I say the name Nero, you think Nero, and you think, oh, Nero. Because Nero was a bad guy starting a few years hence. But when he first became emperor, he was listening to Seneca and another one of his advisors, and they really helped him. So there was kind of a renaissance going on in the early years of Nero's reign. But then he went crazy, and that's where everything went bad. But especially for the church and the persecutions and all of that. But at this time yet, Nero was still doing some pretty good stuff and wasn't being excessively wicked like he would in the future. So Felix goes back, gets recalled. He escapes with his life because his brother is able to, and it wasn't even exiled, because his brother's able to put in a good word for him with Nero. And Nero didn't like his brother, but his brother was powerful. So he was nice to Felix when he came back. So now we pick up. We have a new governor. His name's Festus. He did not play on Gunsmoke. Some of you are saying, what's Gunsmoke? Okay, so we are in Acts chapter 25, verse 1, and we're going to hear about what happened when Festus got there, especially with respect to the Apostle Paul. Then Festus arrived in the province. Oh, let's let the screen flip over. Hopefully it will. There we go. Then Festus arrived in the province. 3 days later, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priests and prominent men among the Jews brought charges to Festus against Paul and began pressuring him. They kept asking a favor at Paul's expense that he might be summoned and brought to Jerusalem. At the same time, they were planning to ambush to kill him along the way. Doesn't sound like he had a fair shake going on there at that particular time. Festus comes into town, and it only takes him 3 days to get up to Jerusalem. And the reason it only took him 3 days is because Jerusalem was Felix had created such a mess in Jerusalem that Festus needed to go there to be able to soothe feelings, and the warring factions were getting worse. As the destruction of Jerusalem drew near, the factions became absolutely vicious against each other. There were murders, there were assassinations, all sorts of really bad stuff was going on in Jerusalem, and this was just the starting time when all of that stuff really began to set in. Sadducees against Pharisees, zealots against conformists. Just all sorts of ways that you could get yourself killed. Well, I'm just not going to say anything. Dead. Well, I'm going to say something. Dead. It was just that bad. You couldn't win. They would kill you for whatever they perceived was a problem. We need to kill that person because of this or that person because of that. So it was getting pretty ugly in Jerusalem. And Festus goes up there. I may say Felix by accident, but I'm officially done talking about Felix, I think. No, he will come up later. Okay. But Festus goes up to Jerusalem to be able to make sure that he's able to start taking stock of what is going on. Okay, it says that the chief priests came together. The Jewish leaders had not forgotten about Paul. Festus shows up, and they go, now's our chance. This guy's green. He's going to want to start out on the right foot, and so we've got him. Now, it says chief priests. Ananias had been deposed. Ananias was the guy who previously had Paul slapped, and Paul had said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. God did strike him. He was removed from office by Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa II, the son of Herod Agrippa I, the bad guy who had James killed and who also arrested Peter, and died in 44 AD, as the Bible says, eaten by worms. Not a pleasant ending. But he was not a very nice man either. His son, Herod Agrippa, was only 17. The second was only 17 at the time that his dad died. And so Claudius was going to give him the kingdom. the rule over Judea and a whole bunch of territory until some other folks in Rome stepped in and said, he's a bit young at the age of 17. And he was being raised in Rome, which is why Claudius knew him. So they put Agrippa over in a very small kingdom to begin with, and then he gained in authority as he demonstrated, and they gave him more as he demonstrated his ability to handle it. But the one thing they gave him right away was he was the procurator of the temple, or the curator of the temple. And so he could depose the high priest. And he did. He deposed Ananias, and he put in another high priest, Ishmael, and but now Ananias still held a lot of power, but there were kind of two of them co-sharing, again, which causes very big tension among the Sadducees even, because now there were two political factions in the Sadducees. How do you split these people up even further? Well, let's add another high priest. By the way, they did. Anyway, so they just kept on doing stuff that created more and more tension in the area. So the Jewish leaders hadn't forgotten Paul, so they decided to ask Festus if he would grant them a favor, and the favor would be at Paul's expense. They knew that Paul was safely ensconced in Caesarea. He was in Herod's praetorium, or Herod's palace, and you weren't breaking in there to kill him. And so they thought, well, let's get him up here. Festus is up here with us, and say, summon Paul and have him come. And those same 40 guys that 2 years earlier that had sworn to give their lives to kill Paul, I'm sure they were still able to be called up in a moment's notice. And so they said, so we're going to set up an ambush along the way. So because they thought, we're going to take advantage of this Festus guy. So they were pressuring him for a favor, even as they were planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Okay, so next verses. Festus responded that Paul was being kept in Caesarea, but that he himself was about to go there in short order. Therefore, he said, let competent men from among you go with me. And if there is any wrong in this man, let them bring charges against him. After remaining with them for no more than 8 or 10 days, he left for Caesarea. On the next day, he sat upon the judge's seat in order that Paul be brought. So Festus exercised a bit of wisdom. It means he had some wisdom in him. And he, by the way, was a pretty good governor. It was like he was a breath of fresh air. After Felix, unfortunately, he only lasted about 2 years, and then he died. And when he died, 2 very bad governors came up until in 66 AD, the Jewish people revolted, and we had the start of the Jewish wars and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD as a result. So anyway, Festus was trying to do his job. He said, he's really where he's supposed to be. He's been there 2 years. I'm not going to hang around in Jerusalem for a lengthy trial. Remember, he had just arrived in the province. And so he's like, they want me to summon him. That's going to take a couple days. They want to hold a trial here, which could take forever. And so there's no way he was going to agree to this. He just simply said, no, that's not happening. So initially, he kept the trial in the Roman venue, which was appropriate. Paul was a Roman citizen. He should be tried in the Roman venue. They wanted to get it switched up to Jerusalem for their own nefarious purposes, and they said, well, that can't happen. So he went and he quickly sat on the judge's seat. He went back to Caesarea. He got to the judge's seat is that's kind of like the court. You know, I was reading about the judge's seat, and they always call it the judge's seat. Pilate sat in the judge's seat. I'll sometimes call it the judgment seat. But one of the, Philip the Tetrarch, who was governed to the north, when he traveled, because he had such a big area, he brought the seat with him. Because you needed a seat. It was the court. And so when he got on the road and went from town to town, because he didn't want to delay justice, he'd have the seat brought along. They'd set it up in the town square. He'd have his seat. And it was the seat of judgment that he was able to rule from. That was the Roman tradition. Wherever that seat was, that's where the court was. And, of course, it wasn't just the seat. It was the person sitting in the seat. But they had to go together. Festus could not rule unless he had a judgment seat. There was one in Jerusalem, we know that, right? Because Pilate sat on his judgment seat. But it was also in Caesarea. So he gets back up to Caesarea. Very quickly sits on the judge's seat, which is just the same way of saying he held court. And he was looking for a quick resolution to this issue of Paul. You know, this was a guy who'd been around for 2 years. It was a holdover from Felix's administration. Let's get this done with. This is crazy that it's been dragging on for 2 years. You can imagine all this stuff going through Festus's head. I mean, just the way it is. It's like, wow, why has this been taking 2 years? This should have been taken. He probably said some unkind words about Felix because he was upset. Why is this my problem? Because Felix wouldn't deal with it. So, starting with verse 7. When Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious accusations, ones they could not prove. Paul defended himself. I have not committed any sin against the law of the Jews, the temple, or against Caesar. So, Paul shows up. And he walks into the courtroom, and what happens? More accusation. It's like he hasn't seen these guys for 2 years. 2 years earlier, he was in the courtroom with them, and they were pelting him with accusations they could not prove. Now, Luke doesn't go into all the accusations here simply because of the fact that we've just gone through this. We've gone through with Tertullus the lawyer bringing the accusations in front of Felix. And so you're hearing me saying very carefully, Felix Festus. It's just they're too close. Anyway, he did the trial in front of Felix already, and so we don't need to hear the charges again, although Paul does, in his defense, make reference to the charges they're bringing against him. Notice they didn't bring any evidence, though. If they were serious about getting a win in this Roman court, they would have brought evidence. They would have brought witnesses. So the fact that they didn't means, number one, they couldn't prove their charges. And without evidence in a Roman court, you were going to be acquitted. So they knew this could not work out. But of course, they were going to continue to press Festus for a change in venue, as we will see in a moment, because they had their same wicked plan to work out. So, Paul's defense is, I have not committed any sin, and by the way, the Greek word is sin, offense. I have not missed the mark. The word sin means to miss the mark. I have not sinned, and so he's, by defending himself in these next three areas, we know what the charges that they were bringing in front of Festus. They were charging that Paul violated the law of the Jews, the temple, and the laws of Caesar. Now, the law of the Jews, we know that when they found him in the temple, he had undergone a purification ritual. He had made sure he was following absolutely the law of the Jews, the Mosaic Code. Now, we know he didn't live by the Mosaic Code all of his time that he was around. We know that because he told us that himself. But when he didn't live by the Mosaic Code when he was away from Jerusalem, that was up to him. They had no jurisdiction when he was in Corinth or when he was in other Gentile areas. That was up to how he wanted to live. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul said, I was a Jew to the Jews in order that I might win the Jews. To those under law, I lived as one under law, not being under law myself, in order that I might win those under law. And the capital L there indicates the Mosaic Code. To those without the law, I lived as one without the law, not being without the law of God, but actually under the law of Christ, in order that I might win those without the law. Okay, so he's very clearly pointing out the fact that he lived under the code, the Mosaic Code, whenever he was around the Jewish people. But when he was around the Gentiles, he did not live under the Mosaic Code because he was trying to win the people. And if he would have lived under the Mosaic Code as he was trying to reach out in the Gentile areas, it wouldn't have worked. It was all about, what does it take to reach these people that God has called me to reach? And that's a good word, isn't it? That's always got to be our question, doesn't it? God has given New Dawn Community Church a target audience. The audience has gotten bigger because now of the streaming, right? And there's people that just happen to come in, or they're with us on Sunday mornings who have never come inside this building or even our previous building. But generally speaking, the target audience is the people of Coral Springs. It's the people that God wants us to reach and to win and to be able to disciple and grow him in understanding of the kingdom. Now, God has plans for Broward County. God has plans for Coral Springs. We're a part of that plan. And that part of the plan is protecting the area from absolute devastation so that there's actually people here who have not been plundered by hurricanes. All that's part of the plan. And so we realize, okay, so how do we reach this area without compromising the law of Christ, the principles of Christ, you could say that, without compromising the integrity of what it means to live as people of God. And that's a pretty wide latitude because of the things that we're able to do. We've still got people that won't come into our setting because we made the change back in 1990 from liturgical worship to a band. And it's just the way it is. Now, of course, that's ancient history, but there's still people today that won't attend a church service that there's a band in. It's the way it is. And you say, well, that's not necessarily my target audience right now. In Coral Springs, that's a given. And so if you're trying to reach out to the unchurched or the formerly churched, if you're doing liturgical worship and organ music, you're probably using the same things that drove them away to begin with. And so now you want to do something which is alternative, to be able to bring them back in. And in our culture, in the way that we worship, I mean, you can tell the culture ties into a certain type of music. It sings along to a certain type of music. And if we are totally divorced from that type of music, the culture is going to have a hard time. It's kind of like I have to shift into anachronism. You know, there's forward, first, second, third, fourth. Oh, there's anachronism. I have to go back to a time that doesn't exist anymore in order to be able to make it happen. So, okay. That Paul says, I am all things to all people so that I am able to help them. And that's kind of our goal, too, to put it mildly. Okay, so he says, hey, by the way, I haven't sinned against the law. I haven't sinned against the temple, which means I didn't violate the sanctity of the temple like they're saying, and they can't prove it. And then the key thing he says, I didn't violate the laws of Caesar. Do you know what that lets us know? They did the charges against Paul, they weren't thinking. They had done something. This is classically where they're trying to throw everything at him and see what sticks. They gave him the ability to walk out of their trap. Okay, that's what they did with that charge. When they said, hey, he's violating Caesar's law. Well, that made keeping it in Caesar's court the absolutely right thing to do for Festus. And so, that's what we're going to find out next. Starting with verse 9. Then Festus, wishing to grant a favor to the Jews, he was still being pressured, replied to Paul and asked, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to be tried before me on these charges? But Paul said, I am standing before the judgment seat of Caesar, where it is appropriate that I be judged. I have done no harm to the Jews, as you quite well know. If I am wrong and have done something that deserves death, I'm not refusing to die. But if there's nothing to what these men are accusing me, no one is able to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. When he did that, you could hear a pin drop in the court. Because that was something that was at that time. Later on, basically, if you were a Roman citizen a century and a half later, if you were accused of anything, you had to go up to Rome and get tried in Caesar's court. Here, it was only for special things that occurred. So, Festus wanted to give Paul the favor, or give the Jewish people the favor. They wanted to say, you know, they want to be tried up there, and maybe, you know, this whole thing about the temple violations, there'll be witnesses, and so his whole goal was to start with a favor and to be able to, you know, he's hoping to grant them a favor. And so he says, hey, let's do a trip to Jerusalem. And, the trip to Jerusalem is a great idea, except for the fact that Paul knows they're probably going to try to ambush him and kill him on the way. So it's not really good. And Paul says, I'm a citizen. I have a right to a Roman trial. And that's really the key point. He's a Roman citizen. He says, I'm standing in Caesar's court. Now, he could have stopped right there. He could have said, I'm in the Caesar's court, and I'm going to stay in Caesar's court as a Roman citizen, so you need to make a decision. However, what did he know? Festus already was wanting to grant them a favor, so his decision could have been, well, we're going to go on up to Jerusalem, and we're going to try it there, because it's still Caesar's court. If his judgment seat is up there, and he's the one trying it, it's still Caesar's court. It's just that Paul knew he wasn't going to get there alive. Or if he did get there alive, they would pressure him maybe to hand him over to the Sanhedrin and judge him according to their own laws, which was a death sentence for him. And so Paul demonstrated that he didn't even trust Festus. And by the way, he demonstrated that by saying, as you yourself well know. What Paul's saying is, you know the charges are bogus. And so he's letting him know up front. He's telegraphing. He's saying, because you know the charges are bogus and yet you still want to do this, I don't trust you anymore. And that's exactly why you could appeal to Caesar. He said, so I appeal to Caesar. And that appeal, that changes everything. Like I said, at that particular point in time, you could hear a pin drop in the room because everyone understood what it just said. It says, this prisoner no longer trusts him. And he wants it to go to Caesar. So Paul's standing on his rights as a Roman citizen to be able to go and be tried in Rome. And again, when we hear he's asking to be tried before Nero, we think, is this really an upgrade? But I might remind you, this is still during the time when Rome was going through kind of a mini renaissance because of Nero's actually being a good emperor under the influence of Seneca and some of the others that were there. And when Seneca died, that was pretty much, he gave himself into his own demonic issues, whatever they were. So. Okay, verse 12. Paul's appealed to Caesar. So what does Festus do? Then, after Festus had conferred with his council, he replied, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. After several days had gone by, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea, giving Festus their greetings. While they were staying there a number of days, Festus explained to the king the case against Paul, saying, there's a certain man who was left a prisoner by Felix. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews requested that I condemn him. Gives us some insights. Okay. So Festus first does his discussion with his council because that's appropriate. In order at that time yet for an appeal to Caesar to be granted, there had to be some extraordinary legal issues. And there were. Paul was being charged by the Jewish people with acts deserving death under their law and acts deserving death under the emperor's law. And that was their mistake. They gave Caesar's court the jurisdiction when they made that accusation. Paul saw the opening and he grabbed it. And Festus had to agree because, by the way, the other thing he could have done is acquitted him. Okay, he could have said, well, we don't need to do that because we can just acquit him. But at that time, he wasn't willing to make that huge political sacrifice because it would have cost him dearly with the Jewish leaders. He didn't want to make that sacrifice. So he says, okay, we're not going to acquit you. We're just going to pass this whole mess on to Caesar. You know the problem, of course, though, right? How in the world do I write this up? I mean, I got to send something along with the charges. So enter King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice. By the way, I'm added Drusilla's name also because remember, she was a sister. King Agrippa had arranged Drusilla's marriage after his dad died in 44 AD, and she was just a very young girl. And so as she grew up, King Agrippa II, the brother, had arranged her marriages, and we talked about that, and she eventually ended up married to Felix. And we saw some, sordid things. Bernice was no different. There was sordid things involved. He had married her off probably twice in this whole thing. And she also, by the way, became a consort to Titus as he was besieging Jerusalem. So when he finally went back to Rome and became emperor, it created a huge scandal in Rome, and so she had to come back to Agrippa again and live in his household. And so, I mean, the Herods were a bit of a mess, but, so. But everyone knew Bernice. She actually has inscriptions that called her the queen or the great queen. She was his sister, but it didn't matter because that's the role she played. So when King Agrippa II came walking into the courtroom of Bernice, this was celebrity in action. And they were coming down to be able to give their greetings because obviously, this is what you do. They ruled the neighboring kingdom to the north. They had some input to the temple. He was still curator. And so they needed to show up and wish him congratulations and meet him. And Felix recognized, by the way, King Agrippa II was recognized in Rome as an expert on the Jewish issues. So there he was with Felix. Felix is like, I'm taking advantage of this opportunity. I have no idea what's going on. By the way, he says that to King Agrippa. He says, hey, there's a guy here, and I am flummoxed. Well, he says that in the next verses, the flummoxing part. Verse 16. I let them know that it is not, they asked that he be condemned. That's what the Jewish people asked. We just want a summary writ of judgment. Just condemn him. That's fine. You don't even have to hear his case. And he's like, yeah, it ain't happening. I let them know that it's not Roman custom to hand over any man until the one who is being accused meets his accusers face to face and receives an opportunity to defend himself against the charges. So when they had come together here, without delay, I took my place on the judgment seat the next day and ordered the man be brought. So he says, I know you want me to condemn him, but we just don't do that. We don't do that in Roman law. That's not our custom. We need to actually try him in the way that he needs to be tried. He needs to see his accusers, all that stuff. Good jurisprudence in the United States of America today, for the most part. And so he says, that's not what we do, and you need to have an opportunity to face your accusers and defend yourself. So he's just relating to King Agrippa what he had said. Verse 18, he continues. When his accusers stood up, they did not bring accusations against him of the type of crimes I suspected, but only some differences of opinion they had with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, but that Paul claims is alive. This is Festus's understanding, right? It's like, I expected a certain type of charge, that they were going to accuse him of some things that actually Rome could rule on. And what they said was stuff that is like, They had some differences of opinion about their own religion. And then there's this whole thing about this guy, Jesus. They say he's dead. Paul says he's alive. Can you imagine this poor Roman governor? Just looking, he's at this trial. He's going, okay, let's get this. You guys are bloodthirsty. You want him dead. What's going on? We immerse, and he doesn't. That's the equivalent of what he thinks, okay? It's like, what are you talking about? You've got some differences of opinion. These were the issues that Festus understood, just the differences of opinion, whether Jesus was dead or alive. That's it. By the way, what dropped out? The whole issue about whether he had ever done anything against Caesar. He knew that was bogus. That was totally bogus. It doesn't even show up on his radar as he's talking to King Agrippa. He drops it totally because he knows this is just stupid. So the only issues that I can try are this thing about the differences of opinion about their religion and, this thing about a dead guy that's alive, and I don't understand what's going on. Now remember, King Agrippa's the expert. He should know about this stuff. Festus says, verse 20, since I was at a loss at how to investigate these things, I inquired if he might want to go to Jerusalem to be tried there on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also wish to hear this man for myself. Tomorrow, he replied, you shall hear. Now, notice how he starts out. Since I was at a loss how to investigate these things. He's like, Paul's just appealed to Caesar. That's in my political best interest to kick this hot potato right out the door. Because if I acquit him right now, I'm going to have a mess in Jerusalem. If I allow him, I got this legal loophole, which now will let me look at the Jewish people, the leaders, and say, sorry, I couldn't do anything about it. He appealed to Caesar, and that means I don't have anything to say in the matter. And so he's able to hide under the appeal to Caesar behind it so that he doesn't get blamed by the Jewish people for what comes next. However, there's nothing that Paul has done that even applies. How do you write to Caesar and say, the Jewish people are having some issues, and so could you try this guy? For what? Well, because he immerses and they don't. And, or whatever. I mean, that'd be the equivalent of taking that to a secular court, the issues of, is it real wine in communion or is it just grape juice? It's just, that's the type of discussion in his mind that is going on. It had to be extremely interested. So his perplexity led him to suggest that change of venue, and that's what he says. He says, I was so perplexed, I thought, let's just go to Jerusalem. Maybe something will shake loose. And plus he could grant them a favor at the same time. And so Agrippa says, I myself, and he says he puts it in the emphatic, I myself want to hear this man. So Agrippa wanted to meet Paul so that he might be able to have some input over what was going on. And, there's this, Jesus said, you're going to Rome, Paul. Now, Paul, when Jesus told him that, Paul was in Jerusalem. And then he went up to Caesarea, and he was on hold for 2 years, no movement to go toward Rome. But all of a sudden, when Festus says, hey, let's go back to Jerusalem. Paul's like, that's the wrong direction. So how do you get to the right direction? I appeal to Caesar. The added benefit of appealing to Caesar? If he had just went and visited Rome, what do you think would be the odds that he'd be able to preach the gospel in the emperor's court? He knew what was going on. Jesus said, you're going to Rome, and you're going to be my witness there. And Paul says, well, right now I have an opening, and those guys just gave it to me by saying I was violating Caesar's law. I appeal to Caesar so that now I am going to get to Rome like Jesus said I was going to get to Rome. And whatever happens when I get there, that's up to him. But I am going to fulfill my calling and purpose. Jesus' plan was unfolding, and Paul recognized what Jesus' plan was and was able to grab onto it and run with it. By the way, I'm sure Paul did not walk into that meeting thinking he was going to appeal to Caesar. But he saw the opening which the Holy Spirit gave him. And I just want to take a few minutes to just talk about that, because there are times we want the plan. Lord, could you show me? In fact, could you just show up and then I'm going to get out my daytimer. What's a daytimer? I'm going to get out my calendar. And I'm going to write down all of these points, my planner. Okay, Lord, what was it you wanted? Okay, this is here. Okay, good. Here we go. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, all the way down. Oh, that's great. I know exactly what to do now. I know how to be able to place in fact, I should move over to this location. I should do, but let's do that. That's not how it works. There's this interesting scripture in the book of Romans that said those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. And that's what Paul was doing. He was a son of God, led by the Spirit of God. And he's in the middle of a trial. And Jesus himself had said, don't worry about what you're going to say, because I'm going to grab you by the ear and pull you along. Those who are led, by the way, that's the way it feels, doesn't it? Those who are led by the Spirit of God are his sons. And by the way, the son there is a clear description of his heirs. And that's why the word is male, sons, the male heir. And so he says, those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. And Paul is being led by the Spirit of God. So in the moment as he's defending himself, by the way, the defense isn't very hard. But suddenly there's a twist. And because of the twist, there's an opening to get him further along the path that Jesus had set for him. And right there, in that split second, Jesus grabs him by the ear and says, pay attention to this. And it may not have been Jesus using any words. It's like suddenly in our lives, there's moments that are highlighted. There's things that are highlighted. We go, wait a minute. This fits. And so Paul says this fits, and he knows, and it's kind of in that moment the Lord opens your mind so you can see, and there's no traps, there's nothing wrong with this. This fits. I'm following the Lord, and he makes his appeal, and Jesus has him by the ear and is dragging him to Rome, but the Romans are going to pay for the fare. That's how we feel, you bet. All of a sudden, we're walking along and we're saying, well, I'm not quite sure what my next step is. And time can pass and frustration can build. By the way, that's why we need to make every effort to enter into his rest, so we don't get frustrated. You know what we start to presume? I must have taken the wrong turn. If you've taken the wrong turn, he'll grab you by the ear. He'll let you know so that you can get back from that wrong turn. But if he's not speaking to you about a wrong turn, and all things being equal, you know that you didn't ignore something he told you previously, and you're sitting there, and it's just all of a sudden you're in this moment of silence, I can tell you you're in a 2-year time. And I'm not saying the actual length of 2 years. I'm saying it's just a time to accomplish other things until the next phase kicks in. Because at the right moment, you'll see it. The only thing you have to do is make sure you don't get frustrated and jump ahead of him. Well, he must mean for me to do this, and you know the difference between acting out of frustration and acting out of being led. And if you're being led, you will respond in almost an instant to the thing that God is showing you. In fact, sometimes you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm jumping way ahead of the game here. I need to sit down and pray about it, and I need to think about it. I need to seek good counsel. That's all good stuff I just said. But at the first time you heard it, you're going, I think this is the Lord. That's what Paul was experiencing right here, and it's something that'll help us if we understand there can be long periods of inactivity in our minds. It might only be a couple months. We're pretty impatient. We have our television commercial mentality and our camera angle, things change, boom, 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 boom. Our attention spans have gone down. But it's like this, all of a sudden we can hit that and go, I must have fallen from grace. No. God's going to make sure you hear the next step. In the meantime, you do what you can do. You make sure you get things in order. You make sure that you help your friend write his book. You make sure whatever. Because when you get all the loose ends tidied up, the instruction will come. And it may be a while. Look at Abraham's life. Look at Moses' life if you want to figure out how long it can be. God has this thing. Joseph. Hey, Joseph, everyone's going to bow down to you. But first you're going to go and become a slave in Potiphar's household, and then you're going to prison. And a decade and a half is going to pass. How's that working out for you? And suddenly God grabbed him by the ear. Some guy bursts into his cell and says, I need to get you cleaned up because Pharaoh's asking for you, and he knows everything's coming down to bear right there. That's what God does for us. Paul's demonstration of it, that's good stuff. Okay? It's good stuff. So, the Felix's perplexity, just want to make sure that I actually did this. Agrippa, I must have gone backwards. There we go. Wanted to make sure that I got everything I was supposed to get in today. So, be encouraged. When Jesus' plan is unfolding in your life, there may be long seasons of quiet, but he's going to make it happen. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity to be able to study this section, an incredible section watching all the twists and turns and the nuances of how Paul goes from Jerusalem to Rome. It's still not over. There's a lot coming yet as we see your plan unfold. But Lord, we're pretty convinced already just watching it that you are amazing. How you worked in his life and how you work in our lives. Thank you for the opportunity today to be able to watch, to learn, and to experience at some level what it is you were doing for Paul. Amen. Okay, and to our streamers, by the way, thank you. And to our streamers, we're glad that you were with us today. We'll be back on Friday night at 7:30, and we invite you to come back and join with us as we do our foundational truth study as we continue that. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the Super Bowl if you're going to watch it.